church, our extended families, our spiritual brothers and sisters. And we're thankful for the time that you've blessed us with, that we might be able to spend an hour and study together to increase our knowledge in your word. That'll help to direct our footsteps. We're thankful for Stephen and for the time that he has put in, the study that he has made and created for us, that we might gain and glean all the information to increase our faith. We pray that you be with us in this time of trials and concern, and we know that you are in control of everything, and we rely upon that, and our faith is strengthened because of that. We're thankful for your Son. We pray that you would forgive us for our sins, that we might be restored in your sight, that we might have that hope with you in heaven. Continue to be with us, love us, and have mercy on us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right. So we're going to be in Acts 27, looking at when Paul is sailing with some of his other companions. We can figure out from the text a couple of the people who are there. It seems like Luke is with him because we've got the term "we," and so he's not going by himself. And that Luke is included might give us some insight into some other things that are going on in the text. But let's just to get started, look at the first 8 verses as they're kind of getting on their way. And was there anything in those first 8 verses that you guys noticed or that stuck out to you as being in particularly important?
Well, I might back up just a minute and just think, when we finished our discussion in Acts 26, really in many ways, that's kind of the climax of Luke's account. And now it's not, as we move into what you just suggested we start with, it's really just a history and places and ships and weather and things like that. There's not really, other than God's providential hand in it, it seems like Acts 26 is, and I have to just kind of stop and think back that this was written to Theophilus. That he, in Luke's, of course, Acts is kind of the continuation of his gospel letter, but in the Gospel of Luke, it said it was so that he would have know with certainty the things that were recorded. And it's just amazing as we delve into this, the level of detail that Luke has, just the historicity of it, and the if I was Theophilus and reading this and living in that part of the world, I would know all of these places. I would know what the weather patterns were. I would know all these things, and it just makes the story, not that it's not believable, but it just makes it that much more believable to see this account of Paul on his way to Rome. I just have to stop and think, why is this included? Is part of the Luke's account here of what's going on. But yeah, it's as we move into these first few verses, we read about Julius the Centurion, and we don't really know how long after he presents his defense against Agrippa, we really don't know how long it took, but it seems like it was kind of a expedited thing. But of course, he had already been incarcerated there for 2 years, so it's a very interesting story. But in these other prisoners, I've always been curious about those guys, because in large part, Paul is like a political prisoner. It's not some crime like we would think of robbery or murder or that sort of thing. He's like a political prisoner, and he's appealed to Caesar. And were these other men, were they men that had been convicted of other crimes and they were being sent to like fight as gladiators or something? We don't know. It's just kind of interesting to know who were the other prisoners and who he was traveling with. But Julius,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Bob.
It seems like that Julius, that centurion, seems like he was maybe had specific duties in regards as a imperial courier delivering these prisoners, and also it's interesting that Aristarchus of Thessalonica. Seems like he was a traveling companion with Paul. And we find that mentioned in Acts, Colossians, and Philemon, and several times that he evidently was with Paul many times.
I guess he traveled back with Paul on his third missionary journey with the funds to the church. So he had been with Paul for, well, I guess we would think back maybe over 2 years he had association with Paul. So he seemed committed to Paul, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And I wonder if Luke, he wrote the gospel in Acts. He's clearly a very skilled writer. He knows a lot of things about lots of things. The way he describes like you were mentioning, just the geographic details, the details about the sailing. I mean, there's so many things. He's clearly a really intelligent guy. He's a physician, but we don't know when he's converted. He just shows up. And so, where did he come from? And I've wondered if we get a hint maybe in this text where Julius allows Paul to go. It says, and Julius in verse 3, Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And there are other places where it kind of hints, Paul sometimes explicitly talks about physical issues. I wonder if somewhere along the way he needed a doctor and ran into Luke, and he converted his doctor.
Yeah.
Well, but not only, that's a great point, but the way this is all presented, this is not like hearsay, like secondhand information. This is like eyewitness accounts of what's happening. But it's kind of interesting that they landed at Sidon, and of course, when he returned on his third missionary journey, he stopped in Tyre. But it's just sort of interesting to ponder, the Christians that were in Sidon, they could have very well been dispersed, after the Christians, after Stephen was stoned and Christians left Jerusalem. Who knows? Those Christians may have been there as a result of Paul, in his persecutions. And now they're his support system as he goes to Rome. That's kind of an interesting thing to just consider.
So we don't, like you mentioned, we don't know how long between chapters 26 or how much time passes before the end of that trial or legal briefing or whatever that was. And he actually gets sent on a boat. We can kind of gauge it just based on the time when Festus is the governor. It would have to be sometime between 58 and 62 AD. So sometime between there, he's being sent. And so that gives you a rough estimate for the time that this is going on. But then we get, like y'all were saying, the details. The size of the boats. You get the name of a ship, which you could easily verify. Was there really an Adramyttium? Is that an actual ship? You could go and verify the size of the ship. He calls it a coaster, a boat that stays really close to the coast. And it might seem odd that you have a larger merchant ship that he's going to get on in a little bit from Alexandria. But is actually one of the Roman Caesars, Domitius, Diocletian, I think actually started the practice of running these ships quickly up to ports, even during the winter months, to get grain from Egypt to Rome. And so all the things that you see here, they're very unique and very particular, and like you were saying, it's an eyewitness account. This information is.
Myra is almost due north of Alexandria, and Alexandria in the Nile River basin was the breadbasket for Rome. And in fact, Caesarea was formed as a port city with storage to like compete against the other great port cities. Herod the Great created all that, is a great port city, but Myra, it's very logical because the Alexandrian grain ships would have traveled due north to Myra or somewhere along the southwestern coast of what modern day Turkey, Asia Minor. And then they would likely have gone to Corinth and gone across the isthmus there to avoid the rough weather around the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And so it's all just very, very believable in light of the trade patterns, I guess is the right way to look at it. The trade patterns of that time. If you even look at ancient Ephesus, which is that same trade pattern, they found temples with Egyptian gods there because they were like trading partners with Egypt.
It seems like there's a lot of detail in regards to their explanation on the ships and going from here to there. What type of ships? The smaller ships, the bigger ships, where the larger ships were more suited for open sea voyage. And the smaller ships, in verse 3, I found it interesting, or verse 4, it says, I don't know what the ESV says, but the NIV says, for there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus. And I wonder what that word lee stood for. And it says lee stands for shelter, or standing on the leeward side of the vessel, a sailor observes being blown towards an exposed shoreline by the wind. So it was ships that would hug the shores literally because of the weather and the winds. And but it's pretty interesting. Like Jim says, it's pretty definitive as far as the type of ships and what took place at that time. It's really, really interesting.
All right, y'all want to move on to the next section? Start verse 9.
It's interesting there because it was now dangerous because the fast was already over, like identifying the time of the year that the weather, that they knew that, I guess that would be like September, October, right? I think in AD 58, 59, 60, Yom Kippur would have been, the Day of Atonement would have been like in late September, early October. But to the reader, they would know that that's not the time you travel in the open ocean in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, the Hebrews, it's just tradition. It wasn't a law, but the Hebrews discouraged travel between October and April based on their fasts, which is why he mentions, it's past the fast. We should not have been sailing, but here we are. And so it's...
and Paul has to give him a little advice, even though he's not the sailor. The centurion wasn't. I guess he was more comfortable listening to the captain and the pilot of the ship and that sort of thing than like who's Paul to know whether it's okay to. Later on, he'll kind of get to tell him, "I told you so," but. But it's even interesting down to the detail of whether a harbor is safe. And if you haven't, you could pull up the map very easily to see how the journey progressed and look at the geography and whether the harbor was kind of open to the weather or closed to the sea and that sort of thing. And the harbor wasn't suitable into winter because it was during rough weather. I guess it was just the way it was, which direction it faced and how open it was and that sort of thing. And so even when they got pushed down to Crete, they just couldn't make it going directly west because of the headwinds. And they had to turn and go down, kind of be driven. I guess they couldn't really tack into the wind with this big ship. It just, it wasn't very maneuverable, I guess. And these big grain ships, I think they were pretty big vessels, but probably not very maneuverable and easy to work with in the wind.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember what year it was, but the Roman vessels tended to have rectangular sails. And I don't remember trying to remember my naval history from college. I don't remember what year the tacking sails were developed. But if they didn't have those, I mean, you could get a little wiggle room on those big rectangular sails. They were really effective if the wind was coming from behind you. But I mean, there was almost like you were saying, they couldn't tack like a modern sailboat where you can sail into head-on wind and you can still progress, windward. You couldn't do that. Not, I mean, you'd have to row. You'd have to take your sails down and row. And so
I just thought it was interesting that the owner of the ship was actually involved. It wasn't a chartered vessel. It is sort of interesting when you think back, if the weather is that precarious in that time of year, did they see an urgency in getting Paul to Rome, the governor? And I don't know if that's really true or not, but it and of course, God was going to ensure that he got there regardless. But
yeah, I wonder if they just wanted him. He was he was a problem. They just don't want him here anymore.
Yeah, I think he wanted him out of his hair.
Yeah, I had you mentioned a minute ago. I had a note that geographically, Fairhavens faces the wrong direction for a winter port.
Yeah,
and so they were trying to get to a port that faced the right way.
Yeah, if you just Google maps and look at the Isle of Crete, it becomes really obvious that everything he's writing is very, very accurate and true.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, any other comments on that on 9 through 12? I have wondered, and it'd be interesting to get y'all's opinions on verse 10, where Paul says, "I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives." I go back and forth. I don't know that he is speaking with divine authority there. He certainly doesn't say, "God has told me." He just says, "I perceive." And it's almost like he's saying, "Hey, I've been around a lot. I've done my fair share of sailing. This is not going to be good if we go forward." Whereas later he'll say, "God has told me." And so I've often wondered, at this point, is he just guessing? Like,
it seems to be kind of a combination of he had sailed, he had been in that part of the Mediterranean before, and then it's almost like you said, it's kind of like a hunch. This is just not going to end good. It doesn't seem to, in my mind, it doesn't seem to be like God's revealed that to him at this point. But
yeah, seems to me that it was Paul's uninspired opinion. I would think that's correct too.
Yeah.
I guess that's the interesting part, though, the combination of him knowing that God intends for him to get and will get him to Rome, but also here just having the common sense to say, this is not a good idea. And just being pretty upfront about that. I think we're allowed to use our common sense. God gave us good common sense to use it. So it's just kind of, you read that and I think, like you said, Dad, I think this is kind of a hunch. It's like, we might say I've got a gut feeling about this and it's not good, right? That's kind of how I read that.
Yeah. Yes.
And it seems interesting that Paul didn't push. He had mentioned that this might not be, the outcome might not be as what they expected with the loss of cargo and ship and lives. And he didn't pursue it any further at that point. It seems like the centurion was persuaded by the owner of the helmsman, and Paul didn't push it any further. or didn't, push back so much on it. Just voiced his opinion, his feelings, and let it go at that.
Kind of interesting. In verse 12, it seems like the majority advised to set sail from there also. So
Yeah.
I wonder how many of the prisoners got to vote.
Well, it does kind of give us, a real world application of what Paul will write, like in the letter to the Romans, to submit yourself to the governing officials. Well, here he is doing that. He says we're all going to die, and the centurion says we're sailing on, and Paul says, "Okay."
Yeah.
It's an interesting moment where we get to see Paul practicing what he preaches. All right, so let's jump down to the storm, starting in verse 13 down through about verse 20. And they're not related at all, but Dante's Inferno, abandon all hope ye who enter here. I always think of that when we read this section about this storm that's coming, and Paul knew, and he's like, well, I guess we're dead.
So they had a little lull and they got optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
And they headed out, and the optimism didn't last very long, apparently.
So I noticed in verse 17, they're lowering the gear, which makes me think that they're taking that big sail down.
Yeah.
So that would kind of, in my mind, that would kind of make me think that they don't have the ability to tack the ship. And then later, they're going to throw the gear off the boat. I am not a sailor, but I would imagine that if you're throwing the gear off the boat, that's like the last thing you do. If you're throwing that stuff off, the tackle and the rigging and all, if you're throwing that overboard, you are.
Well, being a grain ship, it probably ran pretty low as they say, low in the water. It probably didn't have the ability to move through, large, heavy storm waves and that sort of thing without being swamped. And so they're doing everything they can to lighten the ship, it seems. And like you said, I'm not a sailor. I get seasick here. I have some appreciation a little later on when they have this abstinence of food from the time I was seasick. So, but yeah, it seems like, and we says when they neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, that that's indicative to me of we think of like a hurricane that cannot. There's no sunshine. They couldn't even navigate. That would have been their means of navigation. They didn't have GPS, or it was by the sun and the stars that they would even know where they're located. And they're just lost in this storm, and it's bad. But even like the Syrtis Sands, I mean, it's just these little minor points that they, lest they should run aground on the Theophilus. I think anyone that was educated in that time knew of all these places and were aware of them and that sort of thing. And just that we're just saying it again, but the detail here is just quite amazing, I think. And I'm sure it probably rivals many historical accounts in that era.
21 is pretty funny to me. He probably didn't say it like that, but you just read it and he's like, I told you so. I told you guys this was going to happen. I mean, obviously it's not all doom and gloom, but it is funny just hearing him read that. Man, you should have listened to me. We should not have done this. And it's just kind of that, I think that's a little bit of the turning point where people start to look to him as being a little bit of a leader on the ship anyways, in terms of a voice that they want to listen to in this time of distress, which is really neat, because that's of course not coming from Paul. Paul's confidence and his his peace in that moment of distress is coming from God, which is the cool thing, right? And the amazing thing. But that's kind of like they're in this hopeless situation, and now they have something to look to in terms of hope, and that's coming directly from God.
If you don't, you can kind of read over it, and it seems like this storm's like all these events are happening pretty quickly. But the third day, and then later on the 14th night. I mean, this is bad, and this is miserable.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure it's you just get to the point, and we kind of see that later on. But you can just lose complete hope when it just you can't see the sun, you can't see the stars, the waves are incredible, the winds are ferocious, and it's going on day after day. So I imagine Paul's tone was pretty, man, I told you.
Yeah.
But he says, now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss, because an angel stood, angel of God to whom I belong. I thought that was, I wonder how they took that. Because you would think at least Julius would have had some knowledge of what Paul presented before Agrippa. I have to believe he had at least some, because, he's there 2 years, and he's had, you can kind of say 3 trials, but they're really 3 great defenses of the gospel and what's going on. And so when he says that, I just wonder how they all took that.
And he's probably being called a member of the Augustan cohort. Those are often auxiliary units raised from local soldiers. And so he's local to the area. We assume he's local to the area where Paul would be getting sent from. And he's a centurion. So he's been in the military 15 years. I mean, that's about what it would take to become a centurion, 15, 20 years. And so he's been around. He's probably there when Paul is, like you're saying, being ferried back and forth to his various appearances. And I agree. I wouldn't be surprised if he kind of knew, who Paul was, which explains him being nice at the beginning. Centurions are not lightweights. They become military leaders because they know what they're doing. And so the fact that he allows Paul that liberty at the beginning of chapter 27 does seem to indicate that he knows him.
Mhm.
It's kind of weird. The centurion is really trusting his life to Paul. He trusts that Paul isn't going to run away. And so that's
I don't think Julius looks as Paul as some dangerous person. I think he probably looks at him as a pretty reputable. And of course, Paul would certainly come across as a very educated. He's not a rabble rouser that Julius is having to deal with. But of course, here this is the second time, if we recall back when Paul was in Jerusalem, that Jesus actually appeared to him and said, "You're going to Rome." And now the angel comes, so this is the second. Warning's not the right word. Encouragement maybe is the right word that he's received, that he's going to get to Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Something else that stands out to me when Paul is talking there, and he says in 24, "And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you." I feel like that's kind of a theme that runs throughout the biblical narrative of, the people that God blesses, the people that generally are around those people tend to also be blessed. As we've kind of read through the Genesis account in our Thursday night study, we've kind of seen that with Abraham and his offspring. And it's like the people that God blesses those people. And then the people that generally are around that individual, they receive a lot of blessing as well. And here it's like those people probably were as good as dead. Those prisoners were probably as good as dead whenever they got to where they were going. But in this instance, they probably all should have died from the storm, but God spares their lives because Paul is there with them. So that's kind of neat to look at.
I also think it's interesting that an angel appearing to somebody wasn't thought of as incredible. Imagine if you're debating travel plans with family and somebody in that discussion says, well, an angel appeared to me and said that we should go to Fairbanks. You'd say that's ridiculous. But here Paul says, the angel of the God that I served appeared and told me that we are going to be okay. When just a second ago in verse 20 it says we had abandoned all hope of being saved. And here I don't know if it's that they're so desperate that they'll latch on to anything that offers them hope, or maybe that is it. Maybe God waited to send that messenger until they were so desperate that they would latch on to anything, so that when Paul says, hey, I know it seems like we're all dead men, but God said he's going to deliver us, that they're willing to listen. I don't know with the timing.
It is sort of interesting that he divulges that right after he tells them, I told you so. Yeah, because usually when we see an angel appear, it's such a frightening thing, really. And it's an amazing encouragement thing here, given the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting that in verse 26, running the ship aground, he mentions like a sailor's nightmare. We're going to run aground on an island, and through that we will be saved. We saw earlier in the text where they're trying to avoid running aground, because if you do that, you're going to lose the ship. And so it's interesting that we have God. God sends this angel after they've given up hope, and he tells them the way they're going to be saved is through the very thing that they have been so desperately trying to avoid. It's almost like God says, we're going to do everything the opposite of the way that you thought you were going to do it. My way is different.
Yeah, they're taking soundings, and they want to see how deep the ocean is and where they're at, and they're wanting to escape the ship, because it's like you said, if they run aground, it's going to break up, and you're not going to have very much control over abandoning the ship and that sort of thing. It does make me wonder too, were the other prisoners chained or shackled, or that kind of thing? We don't know. We kind of lose track of them at that point. But it's a precarious thing to run aground and break up on the rocks.
Well, there's way more people on the ship. Like in my mind, when I think back on this story, it doesn't seem like, in my mind, there's not that many people on the ship. And then in verse 37, it says there were 276 people on the ship. So there were a lot of people there. I don't know if a lot of those were prisoners. I'm guessing maybe, but it wasn't like there were, I think sometimes we think about like crossing the Sea of Galilee or something, and there's like 12 guys on a boat, and it's like, no, this was like a big ship with a lot of people on it. It's just kind of a different, when you think about it from that perspective, it's just kind of a different scenario.
I think verse 30 is kind of interesting. It kind of tells the tale. The sailors were seeking to escape from the ship when they let down the skiff into the sea. The actual sailors were ready to to just let all the others perish, and they were going to escape.
Yeah, when the sailors are abandoning ship, you know that
Bad. It's bad.
I guess they pretty much knew that if you run aground, it's pretty much over. So they were getting out.
But then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff, so they couldn't leave. Yeah, this was probably just a very small boat that they just used when they got into a harbor to just take over to shore. This was not a series of lifeboats. They probably just had one or two small little skiffs to get to shore from the main boat.
and that's something that we don't see anymore. At least I'm not familiar with people towing a smaller boat behind them. Maybe they do. But like ocean-going vessels don't do that anymore. Oil tankers don't have a little boat that they drag behind them. It just and so it's all these ancient details about nautical travel. It's just to come back to what you said earlier. It's so precise. It is amazing. And then you have I don't remember the name of the conquistador who did it. Burned all of his boats.
Yeah.
I know Tariq did it, the North African Islamic conqueror who went into Spain. When he got to Gibraltar, he burned all his boats. And it's that moment where there's no turning back. we are fully committed to this course. And
it's pretty amazing. You get to verse 33. Today is the 14th day. You have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. I mean, they had to be just weak. Of course, if you've ever been out on the ship and get seasick and throwing up, you're not too enamored with eating.
Yeah, I remember we were out on a big lake one time, and there were 6-foot waves, and it felt like the world is rocking, and those are small waves. So here, if you get seasick, you are seasick. Probably if you don't get seasick, you've been seasick.
It's interesting that he took the bread and he gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. That he took time to recognize God and to acknowledge Him, and of course he knows he's going to survive this because of the angel, and then he said then they were all encouraged. So that was a very good thing that he led the rest of the men on the ship in.
Well, it's probably was such an emotional up and downs, thinking if you're afraid of dying, thinking you're going to die during the day, you can imagine what it felt like during the night. And when Paul knew this, he says, you have been in constant suspense. And that's what it was. You didn't know what was going to happen next. And Paul's urging them and encouragement probably meant a lot.
I once went on an overnight fishing trip with some of the guys I work with, and it was my first and last, and I got seasick. But one of the things that, and I wasn't down in the berths in the bottom. I was up in top where there were windows, but it was a dark night. It wasn't a stormy night per se, but it was pretty choppy. But the thing that I recall is I could lay on the bunk and I could literally put my hand right in front of my face and I couldn't see anything. And to think about being in one of these ships for 2 weeks and you're just tossed to and fro, up and down, and at night you can't see anything. It's terrifying. So
you went on 2 fishing trips, your first and your last.
Yeah.
It's the eating is pretty significant. When I don't think it is the Lord's Supper. Some people have tried to make it that because it talks about breaking the bread and then they all eat it. It doesn't seem like it is. I mean, I guess it's not outside the realm of possibility, but it just doesn't seem like it is. Mm-hmm. But the idea of Paul basically blessing this bread or dedicating this bread to his God and then giving it to the soldiers, that's more significant to those people than I think I realized that it would be. When we sit down as a family and we say grace or we bless the food, I don't often think of it now as, well, this food now has been dedicated to God. And if you partake of it, you are partaking in food that has been offered or dedicated to the Lord. And so you are partaking in table fellowship in a manner of speaking with the Lord. But that very much would have been how an ancient person thought it, which is why you have those discussions over in Corinth about eating the food sacrificed to idols. Because if you ate food that was dedicated to a god, people saw that as you having partnership or fellowship with that god. And so that's what Paul tries to explain to those people. Look, the idols are nothing. It's just meat. You can eat it if you want. You don't have to if you don't want. And so here, when it seems like the sailors would have thought that, all right, we're eating food that has now been dedicated to Paul's God. And so we are trusting in this God to deliver us. Not necessarily that they're all going to be disciples and follow him faithfully for all their lives. They might after the journey. I don't know. But that they're willing to enter into that meal with Paul's God. That they're kind of recognizing him. Okay, this really is a God, and he could deliver us. It could also just be that they were really hungry and they didn't care what Paul said. I don't know, but I just thought it was interesting that there's a possibility that this is a much more significant event than I often perceive it to be.
Well, just the fact of the matter that Paul took that time to do that in considering all the things that have happened, it just speaks to Paul's character and his, his standing with God, I think.
And it seems also that Paul had the foresight in what they were facing, as he encouraged their hearts with his words, nourished their bodies. Over 200 souls on that body, not knowing what to expect the next day, but at least they were nourished and encouraged and able to take it on. And Paul was a big part of that.
Is the fact they were eating bread more likely just that bread would have been easy to travel with on a ship that's going that far? I feel like that they would have had bread to eat more so than him having thought beforehand I'm going to make sure I have bread to take communion while I'm on this vessel as a prisoner. They probably had bread to eat, I feel like.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think he packed special provisions.
I don't think the ship's cook was probably too busy during all this.
It does make me think a little bit of just the fact, kind of what you were talking about, Stephen, with kind of this, I guess, connection between Paul and his God and these Gentiles, and kind of what happens with Jonah. You think of another story of a storm and a ship, and those folks they didn't know who God was, but they knew something was going on. And when Jonah kind of confesses about what's happening, it says that they kind of took vows, and I mean they worshiped God in that moment. It's not that that's the same thing that's going on here, but it is kind of curious. You think about kind of those other circumstances we read about in Scripture, with kind of one of God's own and Gentiles in that scenario, and you kind of see some sort of things going on like that. It's kind of interesting.
And historically, sailors have been both some of the most superstitious people and some of the most religious people. Because you find yourself out in the ocean in the middle of a storm like this, and you realize how insignificant and powerless you are. Mm-hmm. There is nothing you can do. And so, connecting that like you did, back to Jonah, that is a group of people, sailors, who would be much more inclined to believe what they saw. They're out there in the middle of the ocean and they should have all died, but then they don't. And it's because Jonah says it was his God. And then here all these soldiers, they're kind of in the thick of it still, but they know that they should die. And then Paul says, no, you're going to make it. Every single person on this boat, which is not statistically feasible, every single person on this boat is going to make it alive out of this terrible storm. At the end of that, it would seem like they would believe what they saw. That there is something to this God that Paul is talking about. I guess it's akin to I guess it's not a parable, but a saying there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. It's kind of the same thing, where when you find yourself in those difficult circumstances, the facade falls away and we realize how powerless we are in the face of the universe. And you've got to look to something stronger. All right, so let's actually go through the shipwreck. I think we've got about 5 minutes or so left, and I think we can make it through 39 to the end.
Yeah, so they've made it all. He's made it all the way over to Malta, which is way off course where they would ever set out from the beginning. And it's just kind of this description, but the striking place where the two seas meet, they ran aground, and it just described they struck fast, and of course the stern was broken up by the waves. I mean, it was the ship was just being completely torn apart. And it's interesting that the soldiers were going to kill the prisoners, because if you lost a prisoner in the Roman world, you were the guard or the soldier, just like the Philippian jailer. He knew what the ramifications of that were going to be. But the centurion seems to be a excellent character, I guess. And then I think he was probably heavily influenced by Paul in his reactions to all this. So they all escaped safely just because this centurion is has a kind heart, given the circumstances. Yeah.
And that would have been a completely acceptable explanation. Let's just say there's 100 prisoners on the boat. There may not have been that many, but we'll just say 100. If he has to go back to Rome and report that all 100 prisoners were executed because there was a shipwreck, the person receiving the report would have said, "Good job, go back to duty." But here he breaks protocol because he wants to save Paul. So I think that's a good point that you made.
Yeah, I just really do believe he knew about Paul's circumstances and in Caesarea, and probably had some appreciation for Paul more so than just the normal prisoner. I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
That's just God's hand in all this, though. And when you think about it, because just what you said, that would have not have been out. They would not have been questioned whatsoever if they had just killed all the prisoners. It would not be like our society today. They would not have been questioned.
I would encourage everybody to just Google Mediterranean storms, and you can read, and it's pretty fascinating. They look basically like hurricanes. I mean, so when you read this account, it's not like some little storm blew up. It could have been whatever, but there certainly was the capability of one of these storms that very commonly go through the Mediterranean. Like here I'm reading, they recorded 67 tropical-like cyclones of tropical storm intensity or higher between 1947 and 2014. And there was a big one that just hit Greece back in September of this year. And they look just like hurricanes. I mean, so when you read this story, it very well could have been one of those kind of storm systems blowing through. And when you look at a satellite photo of one of these things, it would have been terrifying being on a ship out in the middle of that sea with something like that going on.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. We just have to see God's hand. Paul was going to get to Rome.
Yeah. It seems like God's providence helped in using this good soldier in allowing this to happen, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And it comes back to a theme that I think we see repeated in the book of Acts and in other places, where God is continually using the Romans to deliver his people from the Jews. It becomes, when you look at the overarching narrative in the New Testament, you can see that God uses the nations to accomplish his purpose. He uses Rome to crucify Jesus. Then he'll use Rome to keep the apostles and others when they're out preaching, to keep them safe. Here God is using Rome to bring Paul to the city. And it's just amazing to see the way that God uses the nations. And I don't know, I wish I knew all the different ways that God was doing that still today. But if he's doing it here, and he says that he does it, there's no reason to doubt that even today, different political currents and uprisings and moving, everything that's going on, God is using that to accomplish his purposes. And so we don't have to worry. Regardless of what's going on, it may not be a good day for us personally, but we don't have to worry about the ultimate fate of things, because God is using whatever is happening to carry out a bigger purpose, kind of like we see here.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other closing comments that you guys have? And then, if not, Jim, if you have any announcements and close us in prayer.
Sure. I want to. I know when we started Acts back in January of this year, this was not the format that we envisioned to cover Acts, but I appreciate Stephen leading our panelists and each week, and it's been a really good study. I've really enjoyed that, and I know we're all looking forward to the new year and hopefully the virus being calmed down, the vaccine's working, and we can have more normal lives, and we can all get back to our normal Bible classes, and we can all meet at the building. And I know we're all prayerful on that. Just reminding everyone that we'll be studying Revelation on Wednesdays next year. And I would just encourage everyone, it takes about an hour to read the entire book of Revelation. And I would just encourage you to read that and not get too bogged down in all the imagery. Just read the text in preparation for our studies in 2021. We'll also be studying the book of the Gospel of John on Sunday. So 2 great studies to start the new year. And also our summer series will be covering the miracles of Christ, and preparations are underway for that. So good things for the new year. And as Don mentioned in his closing announcements this morning, just be mindful of the preachers that we support. And there's a message from Roy Finner in Panama City, and Roy works in a very difficult place there, and Roy's had challenges in his